Hi there, my name is Julia and I'm the Children's Ministry Director at my church. This video is all about an overview of what I do for my job. It's very detailed and it will go into a ton of specific things that I do for my job and how I do those things. This video is targeted to bless whoever ends up taking over my role down the road because I don't plan on being in this job for a very long time. So if you are not taking over my job at my church, this video will probably not be super relevant to you. But here is a brief overview of some things that I do. In general, we'll start with an overview of what I do each week. Monday is usually my off day. If you're taking over my job, Monday doesn't have to be your off day, but I'm a 30-hour employee, so I get off one day during the week in addition to Saturdays, and I work a little bit of a shortened schedule. I usually work like 10 to 4 each day. During the week, I'm off on Mondays. On Tuesdays, I do 4 things. First, I do first-timer cards. A first-timer card is basically a welcome card that's given to anyone who visits our church for the first time. If they visit our church for the first time during the main service, they're given a tear-off that's located in the church bulletin where they write their name, their email address, their phone number, and so forth. After every Sunday, those tear-offs are given to me, and I write first-timer cards. Those cards are located in our office, in our back office by our printer, and they say, "Welcome to Church on the Rock." I write inside of them, "Thank you so much for joining us to fellowship and worship. We really hope you enjoyed it and hope to see you again." I sign it Pastor Doug and staff, and I calligraphy the individual's name inside the card, on the outside of the card, address the envelope, and send it. So that's what I do for first-timer cards. Secondly, I add a lot of information to our church roster. I do this through Google Sheets on Google. It's a free feature on Gmail called Google Sheets. If you don't have Google Sheets, you can use a similar feature that is Excel spreadsheet on a Dell computer, or you could use Numbers on a Mac. But to add info to the roster, I take all the tear-offs, the same ones that I used for the first-timer cards, and I plug all the information into a spreadsheet. I plug in name, address, phone number, email, everything that they give me information on. A big thing to note about these tear-off cards. One thing is that some individuals often check that they accepted Jesus that day. I immediately notify my pastor and the rest of my staff about that because it's a huge praise report, and so that someone can call them or email them to congratulate them on starting a relationship with Jesus. A second thing to note about the tear-off cards is individuals can check off add me to the weekly email list or add me to the Right Now media subscription. I make a list of all those individuals for my pastor and I give him those names so that he can add those individuals' email to the email list or to the Right Now media subscription. And lastly, a lot of times on the back, the individual will have a prayer request or a place that they want to get involved in serving. If they want to get involved in serving in my ministry, I contact them. If they want to get involved in serving with youth, I let our youth pastor know, and so forth. Thirdly, what I do on Tuesdays is I file all the receipts that I spent, all the things I spent money on from the given week into a big binder I have. All I do for that is I write on top of the receipt what that receipt is showing. So if it was for the weekly craft, I just write weekly craft and I hole punch the receipt and put it in a binder. And then that keeps track of all my receipts and all the things I purchase. Lastly, I start brainstorming the lessons for the week. So I briefly look at the preschool lesson and the Kids on the Rock lesson and the tweens lesson and get a feel for the topic. Moving on to Wednesdays. Every Wednesday we have staff meeting at 9, and it usually goes from 9 to 11 or 9 to 12, so it's quite a long time. So that takes up the majority of my Wednesdays. The second thing I do on Wednesdays is I make everything that has to do with the lesson, meaning that each lesson usually has a coloring page or a teacher lesson or a activity page, and basically on Wednesdays I print all those things out so that I have all the materials ready for the teacher. So I make the lesson and I print all the materials needed for the lesson. In a separate video I'll explain specifically how I make each lesson and which curriculum I follow. After I finish making the lesson and printing things that have to do with the lesson, I email the lesson to all the teachers. So I email the lesson to the preschool teachers, I email the lesson to the Kids on the Rock teachers, and I email the lesson to the tweens teachers. Each of those lessons is in a different email, so I email all the preschool teachers together, but I don't email them in the same email as I do the Kids on the Rock teachers or the tweens teachers. In that email, I usually say something like, "Thank you so much for serving." I attach the lesson and any additional handouts that they might need. Lastly, I send volunteer reminder texts. Sometimes I do this on Tuesday, but I send all the reminder texts for that week saying, hey, I have you on for serving this coming Sunday in this room. Hope to see you then. And I do that on Wednesdays. Moving on to Thursdays. Thursdays, I always meet with my pastor. The time is somewhat flexible, but it's usually in the morning. And I'll go into what I include in that meeting in a minute. And then secondly, I finish compiling all the teacher resources. So I finish stapling the packet for tweens and the packets for the teachers and things like that. Friday is my shopping day and my craft assembly day. Friday's usually when I run to Walmart to get any supplies we're out of, baby wipes or crayons or glue sticks, as well as all the supplies I need for that given weekend for the crafts. Saturdays, I send a reminder text to volunteers, and sometimes we have events, but that's when I say thanks again for serving tomorrow. And then once a month, here are some things that I do. I schedule the volunteers for the month. So the last week of December, I schedule all the volunteers for January. The last week of January, I schedule all the volunteers for February, and so forth. Secondly, once a month I try and write notes to my volunteers. Sometimes this ends up only happening once every other month, but I just write a quick note that says, thanks so much for being a part of such an incredible ministry. Thirdly, I try and read some sort of children's ministry blog and take notes on what I learned. This can be a short 5-minute video, or it can be a long article by J.D. Greer about children's ministry, but I try and do that once a month in order to increase my knowledge of my ministry. And once a month I try and pray lengthily for the ministry. You should try and pray as often as you can for your ministry, but I try and take one day once a month to pray for a longer period of time for the kids in my ministry, as well as just God's hand over preaching the gospel to kids. Moving on, here is a bunch of stuff about what I do on Sundays. First, we'll start with the 8:30 service. First thing I do, because our church operates out of a movie theater, I set up the Dymo printer. This is located on the children's ministry cart, which is labeled with orange labels, and it's a black small printer. That has a USB cord. The USB cord gets plugged into the left side of the MacBook Pro on the slot closest to the front. So if you're sitting at a computer, you plug in the printer at the slot that's closest to the front. Both the computer and the Dymo printer have to be plugged into the wall. Every Sunday when you get there should be a white plug extender plugged into the wall that allows 6 different things to plug in, because that plug without that white extender would only allow for 2 things to be plugged in. If you can't find it there, you can ask the tech team, and they often know where it is. Thirdly, if the Dymo printer isn't on the check-in desk, check on the cart. It should be on the cart. And lastly, if the printer runs out of labels, there are extra labels in a plastic bin on the check-in table that has a gray lid, and those refill labels look like a small cylinder wrapped in a black wrapper. Setting up Planning Center. All of the passwords are currently in white font because I didn't want those to be public on YouTube for everyone, but if you're taking over my job, I'll email you all the passwords. I always give the password for the MacBook Pro to my check-in volunteers, and I'll make a separate video about how to use Planning Center to check children in. Planning Center is essentially the software that we use for checking children in, so here's the username and password. I'll make a separate video about that, but it has to do with how you log in and how you set up check-ins for each Sunday, and specifically how you get that going for kids to get checked in. Next, on Sundays, I put supplies into every room. So I put copies of the lesson and any needed supplies into the preschool room, the kids on the rock room, and the nursery, or in the tweens room, excuse me. Supplies, you don't really need supplies for the lesson in the nursery, but I always check to make sure that they're not out of baby wipes, Lysol wipes, or snack. Setting up computers in each room for the lesson. I'm over 4 rooms: nursery, preschool, kids on the rock, and tweens. 3 of those 4 rooms use computers, and the check-in table uses a computer. So I use the MacBook Pro at the check-in desk. I use the MacBook Air in the preschool room. It needs speakers to attach to it. I just bought cheap speakers off of Amazon that have a plug-in that attach to a Mac. The kids on the rock room, I actually use my personal computer. In the tweens room, I use my husband's personal computer. So you might need to invest in an additional computer if you don't have one on your own. HDMI cords should already be in the room, but I always bring 2 to 3 backups with me, and you use that HDMI cord to hook up the computer to the TV in each room. You then use the remote to select input until the information on the computer screen comes up on the TV. Setting up check-in, you can see I set up check-in for second service as well, and all of the information for how to do that is in the first section. Then I make sure volunteers are in each room. I quickly go around and I check to make sure my nursery volunteers are in each room, my preschool volunteers are in each room, my Kids on the Rock volunteers are in each room, and my tweens volunteers are in each room. Lastly, the lesson goes about. I'll explain more about what I do during each lesson, but I teach the lesson to the kids do a craft and activity, and I usually pull a table, the same table that's used for check-in, into the Kids on the Rock theater, which is Theater 2, and I use that for pickup. It's just a nice barrier between me and the parents so that I can stand on one side and they can stand on the other, so that when they come to pick up their kids, there's some sort of barrier so they're not just walking around the room. Now note, I usually do this between 10:50 and 11:05. I set it up at the end of the hallway, and you make sure to ask each parent for their tag. This will be more specifically in the check-in video about how to use Planning Center, but basically for each kid will get a tag with a number on it and their name, and the parent will have a corresponding tag. They need to show you that tag when they come for pickup so that you know it's the right kid's parent. And additional information, which kids go in each room's nursery. That's birth through 2 years old, and that's the back room number 1. It's the first room on the right behind the check-in desk, closest to the check-in desk. Preschool is preschool and kindergarten, and that's ages 3 to 5, and that is back room number 2, the one closest to the far doors and farthest from the check-in table. Kids on the Rock is first, second, and third grade. That's grades ages 6 to 8 usually, and that's in Theater 2. And tweens, that's 4th and 5th grade, ages 9 to 10, and that is located in Theater 5. Which computer goes where? I mentioned this briefly up top, but Mac number 1, the MacBook Pro, goes at the check-in desk. Mac number 2 goes in the preschool room. I use my computer for the Kids on the Rock room, and I use my husband's computer for the tweens room. Moving on, as I mentioned in what I do each week, I write the first-timer cards for all of the, I guess I shouldn't put people's specific emails there, but that's okay. For each week when people write when people fill out a tear off that it was their first time visiting at Church on the Rock, I write them a first-timer card and I say, "We're so glad you came." I also type in their email if they were asking to be added to the weekly email list, if they wanted a Right Now Media invite, or if they accepted Jesus. I then email this to my pastor and I print it for my pastor. That way he has a list of who in the tear-offs wanted to be added to the weekly email list, who wanted a Right Now Media invite, and who accepted Jesus. Memos. So as I mentioned, every Thursday I meet with my pastor and I give him a memo every single time we meet. In this memo, I give children's ministry updates, action items, and anytime I'll be out of the office. So updates, I tell him anything new going on in the ministry, any questions I have, things like that. Action items, this was an example of something I wasn't getting a phone check in the mail, we needed to move staff meeting and things like that. I tell him if I will be out of the office at a certain time, and I give him random questions that I have. Once again, I usually have a meeting with him every week. Sometimes it's canceled, but usually I have a meeting every week, and I print 2 of these. One that I give to him, my pastor, every time we meet, and one that I keep for myself in a binder. Third thing I do, I also help organize events at my church. So even though I'm not the main person over events, I help keep track of the dates of all the events. Basically, I have one big spreadsheet that looks like this. It says the month on one side, then it says the event title, when the event takes place, and when it took place the previous year. So I have all the events typed up. You'll get a printed copy of this. And then I also have birthdays of everybody. In addition to keeping this spreadsheet up to date, I also print a small half sheet for all of my staff every week, once a week, that includes all the upcoming events. For example, this is the one I gave them the first week of December, and each date it had all of the upcoming events. I keep track of those, and I print one for every staff member every Wednesday at our meeting, and I also keep a copy for myself in a binder. I think that's everything for this video. That was information overload. Hope that can bless you taking over my role. And I'll make 2 more videos that will be add-ons to this one. One about how I go about making curriculum, and one about how to use Planning Center, which is the way that we do check-in.